Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. Now that the dust has settled a little bit on Fire Emblem Engage, I wanted to do a video that looks at the broader series because, to my mind, this is one of the poorest managed properties that Nintendo has. And that is strange because Nintendo and Intelligent Systems do such a good job with producing new Fire Emblem titles. But when you compare the series to some of the other franchises out there in terms of how they're managed, it's a little hard to understand what the companies are doing at a broader sense. So take Engage as a really good example of what I'm talking about. Engage is an absolutely brilliant Fire Emblem title, but it's also one that has been explicitly made for people that are long-term fans of the series. Yes, you can have it be your first Fire Emblem, but because the emblems in the game that support the heroes are all drawn from the games of yesteryear, your enjoyment of Engage is going to be enhanced by having prior knowledge of the series to date. The problem is, it's almost impossible to catch up with the series via legitimate ways. The only other Fire Emblem currently available on the Switch in terms of the traditional Fire Emblems is the predecessor, Three Houses. The Blazing Blade, which is the first GBA Fire Emblem, and the first Fire Emblem in English, will be coming to the console through the GBA Virtual Console application later on, and that's great. But whether it's the GameCube or Wii, the DS or 3DS, there is a pile of classic Fire Emblem titles that are becoming increasingly inaccessible and locked to old hardware by the day. In contrast, look at how many times Square Enix has given you the ability to repurchase most of its Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest titles, or how many of the Koei Tecmo Atelier series is sitting there on the Switch ready to play right now, or how publishers as wide as Bandai Namco through to Nippon Ichi and Nihon Falcom have been increasingly using Steam to ensure that as many of their games as possible are preserved for players over a much longer term. Even when your console dies, you can have a pretty modest PC and still be able to replay most of those companies' games. Hell, even Konami, for all the criticism that people level at that company for not releasing stuff, is doing a more proactive job at making sure its games are readily available via those retro collections. I mean, who didn't like the GBA Castlevania collection? And who isn't looking forward to Suikoden 1 and 2? See, the thing is that JRPGs and tactics JRPGs like Fire Emblem aren't like some other genres. It's not necessarily a big deal if EA never pulls together a collection of FIFA, NHL, or Madden titles, since sports games age quite rapidly, and while sometimes the most current annual release will fall flat, for the most part, the best game in any given sports series will have been released within the last 2 or 3 years. You may need to go 1 year back because this year's doesn't work, but you'll never have to go back 5 or 6 years to find the last good example of that particular property. Meanwhile, some other genres like the first-person shooter, as much as nostalgia might kick in, the reality is that the older games in that genre don't play as well, and so it's only really nostalgia that drives interests in them. We saw that with GoldenEye 007, which was recently re-released on Xbox and Switch. It was a lot of fun to mess around with again, but really it was only because of the nostalgia that people had for it was so strong. Nobody's going to suggest that GoldenEye is made better than the blockbusters today. It's definitely a product of its time, and people enjoyed it in that context, and I'm certainly not saying it's not an enjoyable game because it is, but it isn't a modern game. It doesn't hold up by today's standards. But JRPGs are different, and other genres as well, of course, but we're talking about the JRPG here. It's a different story with that genre. JRPGs have a timeless quality because the focus on them is on the narrative, the characters, and other such factors that don't really age, and they're not easily superseded. Fire Emblem Engage is a great game, and you could argue that it's even the finest Fire Emblem that has ever been created. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but it is certainly up there, and you could argue that it is the best. But even if that's the case, even if it is the very best Fire Emblem ever, it doesn't replace the Blazing Blade, because the Blazing Blade was excellent for its characters and story and narrative, and they're different to Fire Emblem Engage. Fire Emblem Engage is different rather than iterative. In the same way, the GameCube's Path of Radiance might look primitive here in 2023, and certainly not of the same kind of visual standard as Fire Emblem Engage, but nobody playing the game today would care about that because Again, unlike Fire Emblem Engage, it has something that no other Fire Emblem has, its own narrative. So Nintendo clearly has no problem with re-releases and remakes. It surprise dropped a Metroid Prime remaster just recently. It's got the other two on the way. It has previously done a compilation of Mario 3D platformers, even if that was a weirdly limited time release. And it does have an Advance Wars remake compilation on the way too, thanks to Way Forward. And in the JRPG space, realizing that narrative is in fact important to the genre, Nintendo made sure that Xenoblade Chronicles 1 was available on the Switch before the third one came out. There's no reason that Nintendo couldn't bundle up the Fire Emblem series 2, because they again have obviously no problem with remakes or re-releases. And the way I see it, there's a couple of opportunities and a couple of different slices that they could do to firstly maximize their revenue and actually do a really good job of repositioning these old games for a modern audience. So, for example, you could have an early Fire Emblem collection that featured the two GBA titles, the GameCube and Wii Fire Emblem titles as well, and that would be an excellent collection. They all came from the same era of Fire Emblem design, and while they all have very different and unrelated narratives as we just talked about, they do share some design philosophies and structures. There isn't really the ability to grind in Blazing Blade and Path of Radiance, for example, so they do play in a way that's similar to one another. As a compilation, those four games would feel as cohesive, like it's a cohesive collection, but it would be an opportunity to catch up or replay four of these very classic games and enjoy their original narratives. And then for a second slice, Nintendo could gather together the three 3DS Fire Emblems, which again share common design philosophies despite being very different games. They could also throw the one DS Fire Emblem that got released in the West in there as a bonus. None of these games would need to have much done to them, since firstly, they were already simple but stunning aesthetically, and secondly, people again weren't playing them for the graphics, they were playing them for the original stories, and in a collection you'd have 3 or 4 original stories to enjoy, and each of those games holds up incredibly well because of those stories. It would be a great package that would sell very well. Finally, if Nintendo was feeling really generous, they could do a third, and there is the opportunity to finally localize the earlier Fire Emblems on the NES and Super NES, and the one GBA one that didn't get localized, that we never got. We never got a whole bunch of games from the early era of Fire Emblem, and it would be an amazing opportunity to pull together a compilation of retro games that would really fly off the shelves, especially with fans who have wanted to play a lot of these games for a long time. Now, this isn't just me asking for a bunch of games. I mean, it is, but there is a point to all of this. Nintendo's unwillingness to do anything about making the older Fire Emblem games easily accessible shows that the company perhaps doesn't quite understand the real appeal of the series. Fire Emblem is almost a lifestyle to the fans, and it's a body of work that they love, not as individual titles, but as a collection. Fire Emblem is probably best seen as an anthology of stories about heroism, war, politics, and relationships, rather than a series of individual stories. To look at individual titles, which is basically what Nintendo is doing with their release strategy with this series, it would be like slicing a single story out of that excellent Del Toro horror anthology on Netflix, or cutting out one story out of an anthology of ancient myths. I mean, yes, it works as a self-contained story, but it's also really missing the broader context, and it's that broader context that gives these games their appeal, or these stories their appeal. So in other words, Nintendo, you really need to do a better job at making your Fire Emblem games available on current hardware. Stop making people go to the high seas and just give us these things, because there is still very much demand for the older Fire Emblem games. Anyhow, that is enough for this video. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments. I mean, do you still play the older Fire Emblem games? Have you still got the hardware to do so? Have you turned to less legitimate means to do so if not? Or have you just kind of let the games go and fade into the background of your memory? Sound out in the comments. Let's have a good chat about all of that. If you like this video, you're more than welcome to subscribe. Just click the little subscribe thingy there, and then you will not miss any of my other videos in the future. And if you do like what we're doing here at Digitally Downloaded, not just on the YouTube, but also on our website, where we publish dozens of articles every week and so on. If you want to support what we're doing, it'd certainly be appreciated, because independent games media is not an easy gig, and we do need the money to continue to grow and do what we're doing. You can support us on Patreon. It just costs $1 a month or more if you're feeling generous, and that money goes directly back into the site. So you benefit, we get to do more coverage, and we benefit that the site doesn't fall over in the future. All right, thanks everybody for tuning in. That was good fun. Let's see you at the next video.